I want to welcome all of you. And what is so delightful about these events is that people join us from all over the world. So I know we've got people here from Pakistan, which is so exciting. I've never visited Pakistan, but I would love to. And then I know we've got Sarah from Norway. So Sarah, it's just lovely. Oh yeah, and Seema from Pakistan as well. So, yeah, absolutely wonderful to have you with us. And what other countries do we have represented? Naomi, I'm not sure where you are, but you represent the Netherlands. Are you in Cambridge at the moment? Okay, yeah. Okay, and Chris, the United States of America, our IT Director of Media, Jordan, is in Cape Town in South Africa, Chicago. Okay, well, absolutely wonderful. So the one thing, as we do this event with Jonathan and his colleagues on Child-Centered Nation, the one thing we know is there are children everywhere. And that's a good thing. So welcome on behalf of the Kirby Lang Center for Public Theology in Cambridge. And if you don't know me, I'm Craig Bartholomew, the director of the Kirby Lang Center. Now, in preparation for this event, I was trying to do a little bit of work, but I think Jonathan and his team will know the answer to this much better than me, on how the Greco-Roman world in which Jesus operated treated their children. Now, to the best of my knowledge, I've worked out not terribly well, but Jonathan may be able to comment on that in much more detail. But you know, one of the exquisite things about Jesus is his attitude towards children. And I don't often quote the King James Version of the Bible, but this is one case where I would really like to. And you all know the saying of Jesus, suffer the little children to come unto me. And so children are, I don't want to use the word possession, because we don't, each child is an individual human being in and of him and herself, but they are, you know, extraordinarily precious, and they're also very, very vulnerable. And so it's an absolute delight for the Kirby Lang Center with Compassion UK and Jonathan and his colleagues to host this event on Child-Centered Nation. Now, you know, the Kirby Lang Center is a center for public theology. So our elevator pitch, and I encourage you to visit our website to consider signing up for our emails and seeing what we do. Our elevator pitch is Christian research across the disciplines, oriented towards the question, how then should we live? And personally, I cannot possibly host an event like this today without immediately being conscious of the Israeli children killed on October the 7th, and then the horrific number of Palestinian children that have been killed and slaughtered since, and may well be dying today. So with Jonathan's agreement, what we will do now, before I hand over to Jonathan, just have a minute of silence as we reflect on the status of children in Palestine today, and we hold that before God. So let us pray, and then I will just say Amen when the minute is over. Amen. And so, Jonathan, it's just an absolute delight to have you with us and your team. Okay, Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Craig. A very warm welcome to you all, especially now I know how many countries are represented in this wonderful group of people. Craig, thank you for such a heartfelt welcome. It's a real pleasure for us to join with the Kirby Lang Center for this event, and we appreciate the time to showcase our work centered around this article, which we have all contributed to, a body of work we are calling Child-Centered Nation. And I can share the link to the article itself in the chat momentarily for anyone who has yet to see it. And I'll also share the link to the full magazine, which puts it in context. So I'm going to do 3 things by way of introduction. The first is to very briefly introduce myself and my work. Secondly, then, I'm going to introduce Child-Centered Nation as a body of work to explain the vision. What is it about? What are we seeking to do? What might impactful and important results from it look like? As I do that, I will then move to also unpacking a little of the peace section of the article, which, having dreamt up this concept and then invited some wonderful people from around the world to contribute, I kept that little bit of the article myself. So that's, if you like, my small, modest piece of the article itself. And then I'm going to introduce these wonderful friends and collaborators who join us today. We're each going to take an estimated 5 to 10 minutes each. So we should have no problem sticking to the timing guidance that Craig has kindly framed, and then we'll make sure there's plenty of time for discussion and questions. So if you have questions throughout, and I certainly hope you do, if you could kindly note those, and then we will take them at the end. You may wish to allocate them to whoever was speaking at the time. So a brief introduction on myself, because dreaming up a campaign to challenge many of the most important people in the world to stop what they're doing and pause and ask, how could my country be the best possible place for children? Who is responsible in my government for children? Who is consulting with children and designing with them instead of for? In some countries, these are not new questions. There are some wonderful examples, but I thought diving into such a big topic without any context on myself or how I began thinking about this might be not best. So very briefly, I'm the director of the Innovation Lab at Compassion UK. What does that mean? Well, many of you will know that Compassion is a holistic child development organization, NGO, working with and through the local church in around 30 countries. Innovation in that context, we are really looking for major breakthroughs, new approaches, new solutions to addressing child poverty, particularly extreme child poverty, and looking for major breakthroughs, whether they are locally and deeply and culturally scalable, whether they are scalable in the more typical understanding of business, meaning the pure number of people that they can impact, or whether they can be scaled up to actually affect laws, governments, institutions. And as part of that scaling deep, can they change hearts and minds? Can there be cultural transformation? So scaling of an innovation in our context perhaps has a bit more to it than simply your Silicon Valley startup. We managed to sell X number more widgets in however many countries. Alongside my work, which is full-time with Compassion, I have a small number of other contributions. Excuse me. I'm the founder of Pax Hacks, a small peace-focused NGO, which is catalyzing youth-led peace and has just activated a challenge with students in 5 countries around the Pacific, New Zealand, Australia. I contribute a mere few hours a year at the University of Cambridge as a visiting lecturer. I was just there last week and really enjoy keeping a little bit of a toe in on academic work, having done more lecturing previously. And I serve on the Forbes Nonprofit Council, mostly contributing to articles. So that's a little bit about me and my work. We've approached Child-Centered Nation tactically. It's not actually a compassion campaign. And the reason for that is, as I was framing it and considering how to move it forward, I thought, how can we make sure that all the good impact is for the children we seek to serve? The good impact is for compassion. But any controversy or issues, well, that can land on me. And so I've written it, we have all written it as independent individuals, but clearly how we are activating it, how we are using it as an article around which to enable community, local government, and national government dialogue. It is proving to be an asset within Compassion, and I hope other NGOs too. I mentioned the perhaps crazy level of thinking. What if 40 or 50 government leaders around the world, whether they're prime ministers, presidents, whether in democratic or authoritarian or any stripe of government in between, what if there is a moment where they stop? What if there is a moment that causes them to pause and ask some of those questions I began with? How are we thinking more long term for those who will inherit these very leadership roles within our country? And a challenge you often hear from those in government is, well, there's so many problems now. I don't know if we can think, that many elections or that many cycles out. But as I was reminded by another one of our contributors, Professor Alison Watson at the University of St Andrews, it's not that long term. The dear children we're talking about, many of them in that elder youth age, will be at voting age, employment age, fairly soon. It's not the classic short-term problems versus long-termism that is the challenge for many leaders or in other topics. So what will happen remains to be seen. It's a complete unknown, which for me and folks that do innovation work, where we seek to run experiments, see what the response is, adapt, go again. This is the norm. That level of uncertainty is fine. I'm pleased to say that is being activated with some early stage national government discussions in Guatemala, in Mexico, with some early stage national government conversations or interest in Togo, with the potential to use this in an NGO forum with the national government in Thailand. At a community level in Ghana, where my friend here, Kobina, is from. And so, major change for us, commitments to discussion, commitments to outcomes is what we are seeking. I need to be careful with my words here, not to discredit the value of different types of work, but I'm not an academic purist. So for me, having written the article and have that published, that's not the currency that really matters to me. Yes, we took a moment, and yes, we should be proud of having that in print, but I'm not measured by publications. It's what happens from that we are driving after. So that is perhaps a little introduction on the vision, what we're trying to do, how audacious, how daring we would be prepared to be in how we're trying to activate it, and also how practical. The print edition of the magazine that it's published in will be posted in the coming weeks to 40 to 50 government leaders around the world with a handwritten letter asking them if they'd like to stop, consider children in policy making, and have a conversation or benefit from any expertise that all the contributors from around the world to the article could provide. If I move across then to introduce some of the content from the article, in it I touch on children as peacemakers. To state the obvious, how can you have a child-centered nation in the absence of peace? Our moment's silence and Craig's heartfelt reflection made that point very well. For anyone who's interested in peace scholarship, the Institute for Economics and Peace defines the difference between positive peace and negative peace. Negative peace simply being the absence of violent or armed conflict. Positive peace being the series of building blocks which need to be in place for a truly peaceful society that can thrive and flourish. I mentioned briefly my work with Paxax and the origin of that. You know, the spark that would have me thinking one day, what would happen if there was a pathway and a platform for young people to be peacemakers, to be peace builders, to have a platform on an international level. And again, thinking of Craig's introduction, multidisciplinary approaches and how then should we live? Well, borrowing from social entrepreneurship, which really at its heart says to see a problem in the world, but to not be the person that walks by on the other side of the road, or to not be the person that sits on their hands, but to say, whatever your view on our global institutions like the United Nations, whatever your view on your own government and its ability to bring positive change in your country and overseas for its foreign policy, I think with armed conflict on every continent, with the level of suffering happening at the moment, I would suggest the current system is not doing brilliantly. And our experiment will ask, well, what happens if young people are given a pathway and are equipped so they're not just receiving a 24/7 news and social media cycle of negativity, and instead they are being equipped to respond and create and serve and be peacemakers. So let me stop there, introduce these other wonderful contributors, and then we will move through in the order of, I think it will be the order of our article. So that will be Liz first, then Andrew, then Corbina, and then Pamela. So Liz, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Craig, for giving us this opportunity to speak and bring the article to life. Like it says on the screen, my name is Liz. I'm a material designer, design researcher, and I work under Compassion as an entrepreneur in residence. But I do have a background in international law, and specifically in children's rights and in the humanitarian context. So sorry. So I have a hyper awareness of this world. Tattooed on my heart is the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And as a designer, what I do is I bring the language of rights into the built environment. In the article, I talk about the right to play, which is Article 31 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. Only the US, I think, and Somalia are the only nations that have not signed the convention. So in effect, it's actually one of the most signed conventions, and therefore there are duties that governments and legislators have to uphold, and the right to play is one of them. And in conversation with Jonathan, we will talk about why that is so important for a child's development and the psychology of play, especially in the context of armed conflict and rehabilitation. And when we go through a process of rebuilding, how is a child rebuilding their mind and their bodies through play? So my argument, very, very simply in the article, is when we uphold these rights, we must also do it in built environment, which is something that governments really fail to do. They have these legislators and who write policy and laws and have frameworks to uphold those, but those are things that are not found in a built environment. And in the UK, we take it for the parks for like blasé. It's so simple for us to walk past a park and not understand the effect of a child playing. But there are nations where that's not possible. When a child is playing, they're not doing other things. And when a country and a nation can hold this right to play, it really does signify that they are tackling some of the things that are deeply disturbing in that region. For example, like child marriages. When you see a girl playing outside, she's probably not washing dishes at home. And so it's that conversation of how do we bring the language of rights into the built environment? And that's the conversation I wanted to begin to have through the article. And as a designer, my role is to bring those two worlds together. And because I can speak the language of rights and policy because I was trained, and also have the eyesight to be able to see how this built environment can work, the next step is to actually have, so sorry, I'm in a very large passageway, very loud passageway. The conversation then is to be able to have these round talks, round tables where designers like myself and architects can have conversation with policy to bring what they're doing on paper to life in the place where a child actually lives.
Yeah, hi. So I'm speaking to you from northern Argentina, closer to Bolivia than Buenos Aires. My name is Dr. Andrew Leek. I lead Compassion's response to the challenges posed by environmental degradation, including obviously climate change. My background is highly influential in terms of defining where I am today. I am a son and grandson of Anglican missionaries amongst indigenous tribes, peoples in northern Argentina on the border with Paraguay. And that upbringing as a child was extremely rich in that, you know, my friends were indigenous people. Our playtime that Liz has mentioned was very much in the forest, hunting, gathering, playing all sorts of weird and wonderful games. As an adult, I returned to Argentina, worked on indigenous land rights, and for a decade, worked alongside indigenous people and campesinos in a desperate fight against massive scale deforestation. So that background feeds a lot of my passion, and it also guides me in terms of what we can do in compassion for children. We talk about releasing children from poverty. I am trying to encourage my colleagues to think, yes, it's one thing to release a child from poverty in a vacuum. It's another to release that child from poverty in a context deeply affected by climate change, because the challenges are just multiplied. And Liz has just talked about the rights of the child. My contribution to this article was, you know, we could talk about it. The child has to have a right to hope in a context like this. And okay, it's not reflected as a right in law, but I think as Christians, as a Christian organization that brings innovations and interventions that deal with some of the problems that environmental degradation, climate change are generating, particularly, for example, extreme heat, we have to parallel that somehow with giving that kid that we serve a sense of hope. I'm going to just share a little picture that a 7-year-old, she's actually a Filipino girl, daughter of my colleague, Dr. Carl Ureta, who's our senior climate change adaptation expert. And she just slipped this to him one day, and I get a bit emotional. And I just thought that message that you have just written, which if you can't see it in the chat, basically says happy kids, happy world. For me, is very, very powerful, because if we can ensure that our contribution makes kids happy, that's the first significant step, I think, towards them having hope. And another word starting with H is how. I think if we can help kids see how they can cope with what does seem at times an insoluble challenge globally, if we can teach them how they can cope, adapt, even become resilient, how is very close to hope in my mind. So it's not just giving them a sense of hope just because, yes, that's a good feeling to have. I think hope is what's going to drive the response to adaptation. It's not just the technology. So that's why I wrote those short little paragraphs. And thank you very much, Jonathan, for inviting me in to do that. So I'll stop there and hand over to Corbina, I believe, is it?
All right, thanks, Andy, and pleasure to be on the platform and to engage with everyone. So my name is Kobina Yeboatre, and I live in Ghana, the center of the world, as we say. And currently, I lead Compassion's work in Ghana, serving the needs of over 97,000 children by the grace of God. And what a privilege and a pleasure to lead such work in Ghana. Throughout the Bible, we find God in different times using children, and in some cases, the stories of youth to communicate something. We find where in the times when for a long time we haven't heard the voice of God using the little child Samuel to reach out to Eli. We find, as Greg said at the beginning, Jesus telling the disciples not to limit the children from coming to him, but rather give them the space. And it speaks volumes about the place of children in the world. And for every adult today, we're once a child. And yet it's interesting how sometimes we find ourselves, the system and the processes in it form sometimes disconnected from the realities of children. And so it's important that the work of organizations such as Compassion, and not only Compassion, but many other organizations, begin to explore and interrogate how much more, as we understand the realities of these children, how much more that is featured in conversations over and above just the community level, but into key corridors of powers where decisions and the decisions related to the realities of these children are held. We cannot, in the case of Ghana, I mean, what I would say is one of the things that is not absent is laws. We have abundance of laws, abundance of policies that exist. What you find as very limiting is a certain disconnect in terms of how these are executed and what these mean for the realities of the children and the youth who live there. There are a number of them that are in place, and hardly are there any conversations around how the execution of these policies or otherwise are affecting the lives of the children. And therefore, what is their own real experiences and how do they inform a certain reform or certain changes that need to take place? And we cannot get into deciding for children without getting into their world. In fact, it shouldn't even be that we are deciding for them without them. It should be that we are deciding with them and getting their voices. I have really been thrilled in the last few days how I have found my own 7-year-old child getting me into a certain navigation into her own world. And in certain cases, I see my own inadequacies of how I have understood her realities and her world. And by choosing to walk with her and accompany her in that journey, how her world has opened up to me in ways that I have not understood before. And so it is easy to make prescriptions when it comes to policies, decisions, and choices that affect the children. The ease is really the prescription. However, as we choose and make the choices of walking and working and accompanying them to understand their world, it helps us to better experience them in ways that their voices are shaping and informing the kind of decisions and choices we're making at different levels, at the community level, at the national level, and in key global decision makings that are taking place. And so what are some of the things that we've had to learn through our work? And we find that creating space for consultative and meaningful engagement offer one of the important pathways of really hearing their voices, but more importantly also building the agency of the youth. And that is one of the argument that I think we make in the article that Jonathan mentions around the child-centered nation, because it is not a favor we do the children. It is a right, it's an opportunity that we grant. And by working with them, we create the platform, the pathway of building agency of these children, creating a platform for their voices to inform our choices, and really making sure that we are better informed and more responsive to their realities as we work with them. It is also creating spaces for leadership development, even at that level, and of course, taking into account the segmentation in terms of age, ability, capacity, and making the right support system. Also enable us to really offer the right platforms to develop capacities, but also offer the springboard to developing the agency of these young ones as they think not only of the present, but also the future that they are contributing to shaping, and the same reality that they are going to live in beyond their level. So I would want to just pause here and of course we'll be open to other thoughts and questions. Thank you.
I'm going to now try and share a screen with you. I am an educator. I've probably been in education for the last 50 years. And in the last 20 to 30 years, I've been working with who are actually here on this discussion site among minority language communities. So I'm going to talk about what happens to children when they don't get the language of their education. So let me see if I can share this screen. Okay, so we're going to talk about why language matters. So why do we need to care about languages? Let's see, there are about 7,000 languages around the world spoken today. Language expresses people's cultures, their values, and their worldview. And it expresses what they think about, what's in their heads, what's around them. Languages and cultures are actually part of the richness of God's creation and part of his image in us. To value a language and a culture means that we personally are valued. It's part of our identity. But we would also know, as I'm sure Andrew Leake will also know, languages are disappearing at an alarming rate, and linguistic diversity is threatened. When a language disappears, an entire cultural and intellectual heritage disappears with it. And we as human beings are the poorer for it. The loss of a language, though, is even more important than that to individuals and communities. It's almost always accompanied by social and cultural disruptions, social and psychological trauma. And education can well be part of that problem. So as we see that 2/3 of the world's children grow up in multilingual environments, and an estimated 40% don't have access to education in a language they speak or understand. Most of these communities are from minority language groups. When they go to school, they're forced to abandon their first language and try, and very often unsuccessfully, to learn in a language that they barely understand. Learning in that case is severely compromised, which impacts all aspects of life. It impacts their education, their future, their income. It impacts gender, particularly health, environment. It also impacts the family and the community, particularly where children are forced to learn in a different language and they lose a lot of their mother tongue. The intergenerational communication is also hindered. So where children, and this is happening all over the world. Where I first learned about this was in India, in Andhra Pradesh, where I first went in 1994 and learned about what was happening to the tribal communities there. So where these children were attempting to learn in an unknown language, there was extremely high dropout, 80% by the end of primary. Very low achievement. In fact, most of them couldn't read or write or achieve anything in education. So in this is a failure of achieving the national goals. That's a loss of human resource as well. There's an increase in social discrimination between the minority language communities and the majority language communities. It means that the community can't participate in things, so there's non-participation. It's a violation of children's linguistic and cultural rights, which we'll see in a minute, and it results in a lack of self-worth and value. So these children feel they are no good, that they feel they are discriminated against, and they are at the bottom of the pile. So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I think has already been mentioned, every child has the right to an education that enables him or her to fulfill their potential. And when they're learning in a language they have no idea about, they cannot fulfill their potential. So what can be done to ensure that a child in their most vulnerable years have access to an appropriate education, to a positive learning environment, and where every child is cherished and nurtured and feels of worth and value. So we talk about child-centered nation. So we know that a child needs to be in the center of their learning. We know that child learns best from a familiar starting point. So where there's continuity between the home and the school, that's where the child is safest. Where the content is rooted in the context of the culture and environment, and where the language is known and understood, that's a child's primary or their first language, mother tongue. So one of the things that I was involved in back, I think we started in 2003 with the government of Andhra Pradesh, where they were saying that there was a 75% dropout. We suggested that they did a multilingual education program, so starting with mother tongue and adding other languages so that they would be able to learn to read and write in their mother tongue and then add other languages as they went through the schooling, so that by the time they were at the end of primary, they would be able to learn in a second language rather than trying to learn in a language they have no idea about. And many of these children were telling that, well, those who actually survived, it took them about 8 years to even understand what was going on in the school. So if we have this multilingual education program, starting with the mother tongue, it improves the educational experience of minority language children. It increases the access that the children have to school. That's in a number of different ways. It improves the quality and the duration of their time in school, and it improves the learning outcomes. This allows children to develop a strong foundation. So if you've got a strong foundation in your mother tongue, learning to read and write in your mother tongue, you don't have to learn to read and write twice. They can easily start reading and writing in another language once they know the vocabulary and the way that language is put together. It builds on their knowledge, their experience, their culture, their environment. It provides a sense of identity and security, and it maintains the connection with the home and the culture and the community. So it strengthens everything all around. Where children are learning in a language they don't know, there's very little going on in the classroom. Most of it is rote memorization, copying. But where the classroom has a mother tongue base, it becomes a responsive place, where the child's experience is reflected in that learning process. The child is really able to interact. So a strong foundation enables the children to make an effective transition from the from their mother tongue to national and international languages and to other cultures. So here, I haven't got a picture of children not responding, but this is a picture of children responding to a story in their mother tongue. This is the first time in a classroom that these children had heard a story in their mother tongue. Every eye is on that teacher. And here's a very joyful classroom, also singing a song from their mother tongue. Hang on, I seem to be not doing it. So from research where mother tongue based education has been going on, the impact, there's a growing body of evidence that reveals key benefits. So the child engages more in the classroom, parents are involved more in children's learning, marginalized communities retain their linguistic and cultural identities, academic results improve, dropout rates are lower. In fact, in Andhra Pradesh, it went from 75% dropout to 100% attendance. Fluency levels in learners first and official languages both increase. There's a more efficient use of resources, resulting in time saving and money over mid to long term. It might cost a lot of money initially, but over the long term, it saves a lot of money. Improved skills means more access to job opportunities and involvement in local and wider communities. There's a huge amount of effort that has to go into building a sustainable multilingual program, right through, because most of these languages are not scripted, right through from the linguistic side, so language development, documentation, through advocacy, that's both locally, at state level, at national level, international level also. A lot of research needs to go into it. One of the issues that definitely needs to be in place is the policy. So educational policy needs to often change. Some governments have good policies, but getting that policy actually implemented at ground level is much more difficult. There also needs to be a lot of investment in it and an allocation of dedicated funds to minority languages. And then you have to build sustainability by getting it right into the heart of the educational system. We also need, obviously, partnerships. A lot of the local communities don't have a strong voice, and partnerships with all kinds of stakeholders, networking and collaboration needs to happen. So here's a little bit about language documentation. Here's a dictionary that was developed in Andhra Pradesh. They did it in 8 languages with mother tongue, Telugu and Hindi. This particular one, and English. This particular one is all written in Telugu script. There's a lot of gathering of materials that needs to happen within every culture. These are some drawings from some themes for primary education that come from their community. So this one is of the farming that they do, and then lots of jobs within their villages. Oh, am I going backwards? I just thought you might like to see. There's a young boy enjoying his first big book. There's some more pictures from the local culture. I think this is a wedding. This is another one using local traditional art to build a story. This one was about a little girl who ran after a butterfly and got lost. There are building multilingual education programs in order for children to be able to access education better and to learn better. There's many hazards and obstacles. It's a very long process and it takes a lot of effort, but the rewards are worth it, and children actually learn and they enjoy their learning. So these are children looking in. Okay, when people actually take part in this process, they themselves feel of value, of worth. So when you get all these writers, these artists, storytellers together to actually develop a curriculum for their own people, they feel proud of their own languages, which many of them hadn't before. Anyway, I hope that's given you some small picture of some of the issues that relating to children and these minority languages. I'll stop there. Probably gone over my time. Sorry, Jonathan.
Not at all. Not at all. Thank you, Pamela. So I've learned a lot from listening to these wonderful people. I hope everyone else has too. I made some notes as we were going. I think we have briefly touched on positive activism, government relations, peace, play, climate adaptation, holistic development, holistic child development, design, law, social innovation, faith, education, culture, and economic enablement, not to leave out language. So linking it and perhaps concluding as we link back to Craig's introduction and the Kirby Lang Centre's focus on how then should we live? I think the application of these multidisciplinary approaches is what we have sought to do. We're just a few of the contributors. But in addition, what is the call to action? What is the ask? Well, that will vary person to person, because some people can't wait to write to their politician or go and knock on their door. And to those people, I would certainly encourage you to do so. For others, it might simply be about carefully reading and considering the article, sharing it with friends, helping it spread. Like a wildfire, but in this analogy, fire is a good thing, a cleansing thing. This article, it's really just a match. It's the people that come and collect some of that fire and take it off to their community and share it with their friends. Because a match can go out very quickly. A small gust of wind and it's gone. But it's when it spreads that we see light and heat travel around the world. So the call to action is to be a child-centered champion. And I would ask that anyone who's enjoyed this and taken the time with us would reflect on what that means to you. So with that, we are more than happy to take any reflections, challenges, or questions and engage in discussion.
So, Jonathan, maybe I could begin with a question. This has just been a wonderful, fascinating presentation. So thank you to all the presenters. I just wondered, and we represent such diverse countries and cultures, which is such a beautiful thing. Are there any places in the world where you, Jonathan, or the panel have identified really good practice?
Thanks, Craig. I can jump in with a couple of quick examples, and if others would like to share too, they can prepare answers. The first one is featured in the article, which is our neighbour in Ireland. The Irish government ran a national consultation with 3 to 5-year-old children. And Professor Imelda Coyne, who was the lead author and ran that process, she's at Trinity in Dublin. And she, to my delight, was happy to contribute to the article. So that showcased the work of the Irish government. Also, when you look at some of the data, and I should state that, this is a practitioner article, so it's not deeply analytical, but in preparing it, I did look at some high-level policy approaches, and our Scandinavian neighbours have some fascinating approaches, some very different ways of considering child development. Louise Holloway, who's a teacher in the UK with over 25 years experience with early years, she also contributed to the paper, and she brings a great comparison between the approach in the UK, which is initially play and discovery based, but then quickly becomes about passing tests, versus Scandinavian peers, where the focus on play and more self-led holistic development goes for many, many more years. And if we then overlay the rapid technological change we see happening at the moment with artificial intelligence, etc., and we consider the changing job opportunities in the future, my personal conclusion is we need to be equipping children with the greatest possible levels of creativity, that which is the human spark and certainly currently cannot be matched by AI. Andrew.
I'll unmute first, that will help. Craig, it's a great question. My immediate reaction was, no, I haven't seen it anywhere, but just going back to my own background, that I did doctoral field research amongst resettled hunter-gatherers in Western Paraguay, just to give you the context.
Wow.
And one of the things, having brought up 3 kids who have now moved on, one of the things it's very noticeable in these communities was, you know, children are part and parcel of daily life. And if I cast my mind back to my field research days, the prevailing sound of children there was happy noises, if I can call it that. And I mean, there's research on this, on the happiness levels amongst hunter-gatherers, but that is one context in which I have seen, you know, children are happy. It just, I mean, I'm interpreting this based on my memory, because they know they belong, and they can go from one house to another. They can be with their parents at night. They can be with relatives during the day, and parents, the village parents them upwards. I think there's an African phrase for that, I think. So yeah, I think that's an interesting example, and it's in stark contrast to when you see these kids growing up in peri-urban settings, you know, when they've been displaced from their forest and you know, in more very confined and unhealthy urban settings, and sounds there are not as happy, and this is what I'm recalling. So that is one example. It's not a country, but it's a culture, or a First Nation, if you like.
Oh, that's just fascinating. Thank you.
Corbina, I think you were keen to share, and then we can go to Pamela.
Yes, Jonathan. So maybe just to share, probably from scalable perspective rather than the reality. So, I mean, I would like to start off from the very informal structures that also exist, which offer pathways of elevating the voices of children within the spaces that we live in the communities, and in the homesteads, where as part of certain festivals, certain activities, there are opportunities, you know, to bring children together to hear their voices. And for us as Compassion in Ghana, one of the things that we have done, which I think we see as an opportunity to amplify that together with our partners and of course across the country, has to do with the youth and the children platforms that we organize, which in some cases bring together local authorities and these children on the things that affect their lives within their communities, and how these can be elevated and cascaded beyond just the local context, but through the formal structures, the formal decision-making structures up to the national level. But of course, this is something that can be scaled and can be amplified beyond, you know, where it is. But from my experiences, it's something that is working, and we believe can be amplified better.
Thank you.
Yeah, concerning the whole issue of mother tongue education for minority language groups, I mean, there are some really good examples around the world. Catherine Young probably knows better than I, which where But a lot of them will be NGO run rather than government run. Getting the whole idea of language and education into government, not just in government policy, but in practice, and integrated into the whole education framework is, well, it's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge anyway to develop these programs, but where they are running and where they're running well as a full mother tongue education program, we know that it works. Papua New Guinea, I think, has been doing a lot in a lot of different languages for many, many years. Kenya has some good programs. There's Thailand has a good program in southern Thailand. In India, they're trying to maintain the whole mother tongue thing in some areas, but again, each state has a different way of working it. In the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh, Catherine and I together worked on that. It was a wonderful program that was started. How long it was maintained or whether it's still going on, that I don't know. It was a UNDP program at the time, and to actually get the government to take it on might have been a bit of a problem. So yeah, there are some good reports around the world, but a lot of work still needs to be done. A lot of advocacy, a lot of research, a lot of actually developing programs. It's a big effort, but yeah, let's keep going.
I think I'm the raised hand at the moment. Hopefully this isn't a silly question. I understood that the research involved asking children themselves or involving children themselves in the research. There was a survey done. Was anything raised by canvassing the opinions of children that was unexpected or that wasn't obvious from an adult perspective? Was there anything that's involving children themselves yielded that would have otherwise not come to light, do you think?
Great question, Jordan. Let me be brief. And Andrew, I think this could be a great opportunity if you would be open to sharing a little from your co-design participatory methods around climate in, I'm going to struggle to remember which country, might have been Guatemala, that you did fairly recently. But let me just touch on the Irish work, partly to respond to Jordan's question and also to give you, Andrew, a little time to prepare. I obviously wasn't involved in that work, but have read nearly all of this significant sized report that the Irish government made available, and you can find it online. I think much of what they found, if we apply the common sense test, it might be things we might expect. But in my mind, and certainly pragmatically, that doesn't necessarily discount the value of it. In my time working in industry, particularly large organizations, many of you may have seen this in NGOs and other organizations. How many times are consultants brought in to prove something that everyone knows needs doing? They gather the evidence, they bring it together, they define the report. It provides the added impetus, often the business case, etc., to move things forward. And I don't in any way want to diminish a national consultation with children. But I certainly think that there's significant power in the convening of all that material to provide that springboard for action for government, even if we might look through it and, like I said, apply the common sense test and find out that what children are most excited about and what they describe that they love and what they describe that frightens them or they're not keen on may well be things that some of us might have been able to predict. Andrew.
So that comment about being thrown under a bus? No, This it's a great question. It always sounds like a cliche saying it's a great question, but it is. And I never cease to be surprised by kids. And has anything surfaced in those conversations that we hadn't anticipated? We did my colleagues in Guatemala conducted a focus group, I guess you'd call it, with adolescents. So teenagers, really, so touching 15. And one of the exercises we did just to get the conversation going was just draw me a sketch or a picture of your local environment as you remember it, as far back as you can. Then draw me the same environment today, and then draw what you think that environment will look like in 5-10 years. And they did it in groups of 5. And one of the things that really, really hit me was that a life that is only 15 years long, hoping as a 60 plus, that seems very short to me. But in that short lifespan, these kids were all drawing the same message. They're seeing a rapid process of degradation with consequences for water supply, with consequences for local wood supply, and other consequences. And that was one thing I imagined that they would draw something like that, but I didn't imagine to see the level of coherence between 4 different groups working separately, coming up with exactly the same message based on 15 years of life experience. That to me was extremely powerful, because a lot of times we talk to kids and assume that they don't really know about climate change. My goodness me, that is one of the things I'm really learning. I was just in Peru last week in the suburbs of Lima, and we got a discussion going there, and sharing a screen there just to see if I can just give you a feeling for the ambiance there. And, talking to these kids, you sort of can walk in with the assumption they haven't got a clue. But my goodness me, they were talking about global warming. They were talking about the science of global warming. A lot of it picked up from school, but they'd assimilated it. And they were using that information to answer the questions that we were trialing there for. This was actually trying to develop, or trialing some teaching techniques on how to teach about creation care and bring in science, and do that in a way that can be taught by tutors who have a very limited background. But that's another story. So yeah, that's my response is, do not underestimate what a child is feeling, seeing, experiencing, and thinking. And that takes me to another subject, which is also we need to do more research on, but it's the whole eco-anxiety, climate anxiety. This comes back to the business of ensuring that we approach this issue, accompanying these discussions with developing a sense of hope. So thank you for your question, and I've used it to root back to this business of hope. I hope that answers your question or contributes to it.
Someone concerned about being thrown under a bus. I think you're a bit too light of foot for that, Andrew.
The thing is, you keep throwing buses at me.
Sarah's next, but can I just check, Liz? Was your hand up in response to this topic, or was it something else? It was. Okay, so why don't we go to Liz, and then we can come around to you, Sarah, if that's okay.
I wanted to just also touch on what Dr. Andrew was talking about. Like, children have more language now because they have access to the internet, and they can scour things. Those that are from nations that have access to the internet freely, they have language, so they can communicate things that at my age, when I was 13, didn't have language for. So when I sit with my 13-year-old sister, she is very, very anxious about climate change, and she lives in London. So we don't feel the effects the way that others feel the effects, but she is so articulate because she has access to language that I didn't have. And so we can have adult conversations because they're aware of it. The problem with children is that we haven't taught them to activate what they know. And I think when we talk about co-design and working as a designer, my job is, and we scream diversity, equity, and inclusion, is actually to bring those diverse voices into the design process, because they know what they have an idea of what they're saying. They just need to be trained in the way to make what they're saying visible. And so when we talk about children, it's really degrading when we talk about them quite passively, because they're incredibly aware and they should be involved in policy discussions, but also like in the co-design education, what Miss Pamela was saying of their education, how do we make their education reflect what they know in their language, because they are very, very aware. And so just to round up the questions, Jordan, like these children are just so aware. It's about like capitalizing on their knowledge. And the best illustration is an Ant's World, you know, the Disney film, where you can see like the ants can see what a crumb of bread, like incredibly large, and that is what a child actually can do, that they can see the things that we cannot see because they're so close to it. And so don't disregard their voices, because they can see things that we don't see, especially after we've been so trained in our fields. And I've noticed it with my job. Like with Compassion, I work incredibly systematic because I come as a system designer. But when I come and I work at the University of Arts London, I'm a material designer and I just think in materials. And that's the thing about children, they live in their world and so they can best express it. And they're very, very important in the co-designing process. And we should have more of them there. Even if it's a 3-year-old child, they know what they're talking about.
Wonderful. Well said. Thank you. Okay, I think we have around 10 minutes remaining. Sarah, thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it touched on a lot of really interesting systematic aspects of the life of children. I'm from the US, but I live in Norway, and I would say on many accounts, systematically, Norway has very good benefits, if you will, for children. But it's interesting, one thing I've observed is how large the childcare institution is here. So I think it's about 98% of children under the age of 5 are in a childcare institution. They have only one type here, and I think about 86% start at the age of 1 when maternity leave finishes. So there's a year of maternity leave here. And it's very much regarded as the best thing for a child to be in this institution at the age of 1 as compared to in the home. And I'm just curious, as far as the research you've done, it was touched on some of the systematic things when it comes to, climate change and language and education and those things, which I think is so relevant, especially for developing countries. But what kind of work have you done in these kind of wealthy Western countries, if you will, who have these great systems in place as far as children's play and education and healthcare and all of those things are in place, and yet you see a rising pandemic of psychological issues among children, psychological issues among adults. And I'm not saying that that's all clear cut as to what starts that. However, you do see a great increase in that happening. And my experience, I've worked with indigenous groups in Costa Rica, and the children there were incredibly happy. And I'm not saying they had everything systematically, but they were incredibly peaceful and happy. And I don't experience that necessarily in these Western countries that have these systems in place. So I'm just wondering, what kind of discussion is there around early childhood attachment, building relationships? How has that been impacted by the feminist movement? At least in Norway here, it is very much political as far as why the children are in that institution. It's related to feminism. I mean, that's even psychologists would argue that it's a political thing why those children are there. But if you were to ask the children themselves, do you want to spend 40 hours a week in this institution with 20 plus children and a few adults? I think you would be some really, you kind of understand in visiting those places that they have some opinions against that, but maybe not always know how to verbalize that. So is there any discussion around that as far as kind of on the emotional, psychological level of children? what kind of policies or what kind of ways forward there are in these more wealthy, developed countries?
I think I just need to say welcome to the team, Sarah. You've framed an area of investigation, and we're delighted to have you on board to lead that one. I'm being lighthearted, but I guess the real answer is mostly we are focusing our efforts as individuals who've teamed up on this. We're all people focused on majority world communities. So even in terms of to whom are we going to post the print copies of the Royal Society of Arts magazine? And in some conversations I had recently with an organization who were giving some thought to, oh, have you considered writing to this politician in the UK and this person in the UK? And I said to them, for simplicity, just consider my focus foreign affairs, not domestic. And unless that Minister for Children also will be able to bend the ear of the Minister for International Development and, you know, Lord Cameron here in the UK is our foreign minister, that's not my priority of focus right now, personally, in terms of my where I serve and who is asking me to do what, and so where I focus. I think the best person from our contributors that would be able to respond, I don't want to do anyone else here a disservice, so guys, feel free to jump in, would be Louise Holloway that I mentioned before, an early years teacher here in the UK. And her focus absolutely has been what needs to change in the UK education system. And she makes some brief recommendations in the paper. So it's a bit of a non-answer. So I'm not being joking. I'm not being lighthearted when I say welcome to the team. If that is something you would like to frame and put forward, you know, an opinion piece, that would be the exact desire of what this Child-Centered Nation campaign is all about. Every question I have had in the past few months, the answer has been, sure, this is decentralized. We lit a match. We're not looking to travel everywhere. Please run with it. But in terms of the specific points you raise, I'm certainly not equipped to answer them. I don't know if anyone else would like to jump in.
Well, having been to boarding school, I got a lot to say, Sarah, but I won't share it here.
I'd like to just come back to Sarah and thank her for her question. I live in the UK and feel very strongly everything she has described. I'm involved in education, and I think the problem is enormous. In Britain, certainly, it seems like the treasure of our children, of the next generation, is completely discarded as opposed to the more selfish agenda of adults, and the demographic decline is very clearly pointing to the fact that we don't have hope for ourselves, let alone for the next generation, for whatever reason. And it's probably a very heady cocktail of political, philosophical, and spiritual reasons. But just to say, there is an organization doing very interesting work here on, particularly in the aftermath of a lot of feminist ideology, trying to resurrect the notion of a mother, which is so basic, but in the West, that is a basic idea which is needing resurrection. And it's an organization called Mothers at Home Matter. And they produce a very helpful magazine. They do an annual conference. They have people working in Parliament to try and help on the economic side of being able to keep your children at home longer. Lots of research and ideas on the whole childcare system, which always seems such a fabulous solution, but has in fact led to a lot of mental health and anxiety issues, as you say. So for anyone, Mothers at Home Matter in the UK is just a very helpful starting point, a small one, but a starting point nevertheless. And just to thank the team so much for everything they've had to say, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. I think we're very close to wrapping up, and we will be punctual. I just wanted to come back to Chris, because I know he had his hand raised for some time. In case there was a quick question, we might conclude with Chris.
Quick question. I'm not sure that there's an answer, but thank you, first of all, for all that you've done. I look forward to reading the article. The moment I think back to my own childhood, whether it was at age 3 or 5 or 15, and think how I would have wanted the world to be, my adult cynicism gets in the way, and I can't even remember. Or if I imagine what my children would say to me today, how do we deal with our cynicism that is well earned?
Would any member of the team like to take that, perhaps in 30 to 60 seconds?
Chris, if you could just rephrase the question quickly.
Well, basically, how do we deal with our own cynicism? I can imagine myself as a child or my own children having wonderful ideas of what the world should look like. And yet my first knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, but that won't work because this or that power structure or this or that reality. So how do we get our cynicism out of the way?
Wow, what a question to end on. It sounds like you're talking about me, because I'm probably number one cynic, but here I am trying to lead this. I think, as I said, just engaging in something that can contribute is very important. How is very close to hope. That's not my thinking. I've heard it from somewhere else. But I think just engaging in one practical action is one very important step towards addressing that.
Thank you.
Liz, Kavina, if you're quick.
I think this is when faith comes in. Our Lord tells us to come to him childlike, and it's the work of the Spirit. And it's one of those things that you kind of go into prayer for, to be able to have your heart be tender. And I think what happens in our cynicism is that we've lost the tenderness of our hearts to a thing, because we're using our brain. And the things about children, they don't use their brain, not that way. That sounds very poor. That's a poor way of expressing it, but they use their hearts to express the things. And they use their sound, they use their song, and it's this childlikeness that the Lord actually calls us to be. But that's the work of the Spirit. So I think in a place of prayer, something I'm also doing is that, Lord, make my heart tender so I can see the world the way that you see it. Because he sees it in his way, and just being able to tap into that will help you with that place in your heart that makes you feel quite hard. But that's when kind of faith really does kick
in. Thanks. And great. Maybe just to add, one of the first ways is also to recognize the different realities. Our experiences and life choices and many other things have shaped us in different ways compared to the world within which our children live and the kind of realities they have. So I think that's the first point. The second bit is really the approaching those engagements and conversations with the open-mindedness, and really finally navigating that path, but really in some cases trusting and allowing the leadership of these children in some of these trusted spaces. And it's amazing the kind of ideas, thought pathways that seem to challenge our own formed ideas and what really comes out of that. And I have found that really transformational, even as we allow ourselves to be challenged by the children. Thanks.
Thank you to everyone. This has been wonderful. Craig, we so appreciate the opportunity to have come and shared, to engage with the KLC community. Perhaps we can pass to you to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, so much. And thank you, Elizabeth, Andrew, Kobina, and Pamela. This has been very, very stimulating. I just thought, as I close, of course, we wish you God's blessing in this incredibly important project and the work that you are doing. And I just wanted to make a few comments in conclusion. So that last question from Chris is one that we take very, very seriously in the Kirby Lang Center, to be a center for public theology means that even though we're a research center, I find myself living the Ukraine conflict and living what is going on in Palestine, in Israel, Palestine, in ways that I probably have never done before. And the question you inevitably face is, how do I embrace what Wendell Berry calls difficult hope rather than cynicism? And I think Elizabeth put her finger right on it, which is at the heart of the Kirby Lang Center. We aim to do our intellectual work in community, rooted in deep spirituality. And I think especially the evangelical community, we get people converted and then we release them to transform the world, and they rush off with all their baggage firmly intact. And so, in my opinion, one of the greatest needs of our day is for very deep spiritual formation, so that we can face the reality of the brokenness of the world and emerge hopeful. So, and just in case you're interested, that's why our first annual conference in June, the theme of our annual conference in Cambridge is First Things First, Spirituality and Public Theology. So I think there's a huge retrieval work. I'm a deeply committed evangelical, but I'm afraid the kind of basic instruction in the quiet time is not adequate for the journey. We have to retrieve spiritual practices that can sustain us over the long term. The second thing I just wanted to say is how do we avoid the cynicism? I think another way is, could we not revive around our countries and share with one another really great children's literature? Whenever adults often prefer children's literature to children, I think, but to see Pamela's image of those children, hearing a story for the first time, I want to know that story. And that's something the Kirby Lang Center is interested in. We've got to generate a cultural renewal at all sorts of different levels. We can't just rely on politics to do it. And so that's something if you're interested in. And just the other thing, I think I was so glad that Sarah raised the role of the West. And I'm South African, proudly African. I know white, English-speaking, Earl Grey drinking, but I'm proudly African. And but we must be careful of ignoring the West, because in a globalized world, it's exported everywhere. And I think what I'm hearing from the conversation today is what I firmly believe, that the majority world has got gifts that we in the West desperately need. And we want a healthy, united nations where we can share our gifts with one another. The final point is just, I encourage you to look at our website. We publish 3 times a year a magazine on accessible public theology called The Big Picture. If you go on our website to resources, you'll find the electronic version is free. You can purchase, if you're in Britain or Europe or America, hard copy. We're also distributing in South Africa now. And the unique thing about that magazine is we don't decide what our readers need. We invite our community to write for it. We say to our community, Christ plays in 10,000 places. Find out where he's playing in your life. Reflect upon it, write about it, draw, and then submit to the big picture. And just, Jonathan, if you and your team are interested at all, this would have to be planned a year out. I would just love us to do an edition on the child with contributions from all over God's creation in this wonderful diversity. So sorry for going on a bit, but you got me all excited. And this is tremendous to meet you all. And I wish you all that you will find in this Easter season the Spirit renewing that difficult hope, which is so essential to the hard work that you are involved in. But God bless you, and I hope we can have future contact, Jonathan.